So welcome, everybody. My name is Nash Robbins. Many of you know me as one of the owners of Much Ado Books in Alfriston, and I'm sitting here in our antiquarian book room with a backdrop of some wonderful old books, which is entirely appropriate. And I can only wish that you could all join me here because we are tonight entering into a huge virtual room to discuss an amazing new book, The Annotated Mrs Dalloway, a book which I have spent the last couple of weeks thoroughly enjoying, and which I hope, if you have not seen, you will soon. The book has been put together, edited by the assistant professor of English at the University of Oxford, Merve Emre, who has written for The New Yorker, has written for the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, the list goes on and on. And she's also author of some really interesting books, including thank you, including an analysis of the Myers-Briggs personality test and a book called Paraliterary about literary departments, the way they teach readers to read and what more casual readers enjoy. It's a varied and wonderful background. Merve, thank you for joining us, and thank you for bringing such interesting thoughts to the Annotated Mrs Dalloway. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. I wonder if you could perhaps tell us a little bit about your career and how your career has led to Annotating Mrs Dalloway.
Well, I don't think that my career has necessarily led to Annotating Mrs Dalloway, but
Right.
I will tell you what did, which is, and I talk about this a little bit in the introduction of the book, which is that I grew up a sort of nerdy, bookish, lonely child. And a couple of years ago, before I started annotating this project, I went to my parents' house and was looking through some memorabilia that I had stored in their attic. And one of the things I found was a box of letters. And in this box of letters was a letter from a friend, a boy, that he had written to me when we were about 10 or 11 years old. And we must have been reading Mrs. Dalloway together, because in it, he writes to me, "You and I are not Clarissa Dalloway and Peter Walsh. You and I are Jake Barnes and Lady Brett Ashley from The Sun Also Rises by one Ernest Hemingway." That's maybe my favorite part of the letter. He says, "By one Ernest Hemingway." And when I read that letter, one of the things I realized was that this novel has been with me for a very, very, very long time, and that this novel played a really integral role in stabilizing one of the most important and bookish relationships of my life. Now, of course, it's a little bit funny for two 11-year-olds to think that they're either Clarissa Dalloway and Peter Walsh, two of the characters in Mrs. Dalloway, or for them to think that they are Lady Brett Ashley and Jake Barnes. For those of you who've read your Hemingway, you might remember that Jake Barnes is the impotent American journalist and Lady Brett Ashley is the sort of sexually insatiable British divorcee. So I don't think that was exactly the right parallel either for us. But I think that the annotation really began with this sort of childish and naive, but not incorrect act of reading and of wanting to find some sort of bridge between a novel and our day-to-day lives as readers and as people in the world. So that's maybe not exactly the answer you were looking for, and I'm happy to answer it differently, but that is the truthful answer of why of why I decided to do this project, was to try to honor that earlier youthful experience of reading the novel.
You worked with a company, Norton, which has a rich history of annotated books, and I wonder if that's why you sought them out.
Well, they actually sought me out for this project, but one of the things that a friend of mine recently pointed out to me was that the other annotated editions that they do are by and large books that people are likely to encounter as children. So whether it's the annotated fairy tales that Maria Tatar did, Huckleberry Finn, that these are books that appeal primarily to a younger readership. And my friend asked me, why do you think they decided to do Mrs. Dalloway, which in many ways doesn't quite fit that particular genre? And I said that beyond my own personal experience of when I read it, I think that there is, for a certain kind of bookish adult, something quite enchanting about returning to that Bloomsbury set and returning to all of their experiments in literature, in dance, in art. And one of the things that I think this book allows you to do is feel transported, not just by Virginia Woolf's words, but also, as you mentioned, by all of the illustrations, by Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant's artwork, by the maps that are in this annotated version that actually my husband designed. And you do have that, I think, youthful experience of imagining that you could actually inhabit the world of the novel. And all of the different parts of the annotation invite you to inhabit it in a different way, whether it's looking at a painting or whether it's taking those maps and going to Westminster and imagining yourself walking, tracing the same routes as the characters.
So how did you approach what I would find a kind of daunting project of taking any book, but especially perhaps a book by Virginia Woolf, and finding a way to explicate it, to play with it using the annotations?
I mean, the first thing to say is that I'm not the first person to annotate this novel. So the three people that I will point to as my predecessors include the extraordinary feminist critic Elaine Showalter, who I would say is probably one of the handful of people responsible for Virginia Woolf being as well known as she is today, and being really a canonical author in academic reading, but also in novel reading more generally. So she has a wonderful version of it. Anne Fernald, who edited the Cambridge Companion to Mrs. Dalloway. And then my predecessor at the University of Oxford, actually at Worcester College, where I'm a fellow, is a man named David Bradshaw, who passed away the year before I took my job, which was his job. And so I think that one of the things you're doing when you're annotating is that you're always opening up a channel, a dialogue with other voices and with other people who have already thought about what it is that's interesting about this book. And so you're not starting from scratch, although you are adding to what is already out there. So that's maybe one thing I will say. The second thing I'll say just more practically is that I actually started annotating this book in March 2020. So right when we went into lockdown. And my children, I have two children. So whoever's children we heard at the beginning of the event, I am completely sympathetic. That has happened to me before too. So I have two children and they could no longer go to school, so they were at home. And it was very hard for me with them at home, even when we were splitting care with my husband. It was very hard for me to do work on my scholarly books. So what I could reasonably do in 4 hours every day was go into my writing shed and transcribe 10 to 15 pages of Mrs. Dalloway. And I did actually type out the entire manuscript myself. So I typed it all out by hand. Transcribe 10 to 15 pages and annotate those 10 to 15 pages. And I would say that the final thing, the third thing I'll say is that annotation is an act of rereading, always. And so if I transcribed it once and on that transcription, I saw certain things that I wanted to explicate, then the responsible thing to do as an annotator is always to go back and to think about what you might have missed, and then go to other critics and see what it is that they might have to say about the passages that you are considering in that section. And I think one of the great benefits of annotating is that it lets you be a really promiscuous reader, which is to say that if I'm in my work as a critic, if I write an article about Woolf or about, say, Leonora Carrington, or I'm working on a piece about Mary Butts right now for the New Yorker, usually in 5,000 words, I can only make one argument, maybe two. But the beauty of annotating is that you can be many different kinds of reader. You can be a personal reader, an appreciative reader, one who remembers the way that I do in the introduction, your first occasion of reading this novel. You can be a very close reader where you're paying attention to how Woolf changed a single word or a single phrase from one draft to the next and what the implication of that might be. For instance, the famous first line of Mrs. Dalloway used to be, Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the gloves herself, not Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. And you can meditate on what that decision means. You can be a more historical or politically oriented reader, and you can try to draw out one of the things that I think is most fascinating about this book, which is its really, really rich political satire and the way that the history of the British Empire is embedded in the details of London life. Everything from the statuary that Peter Walsh walks by to the particular hotels or the Oriental Club, right? Those landmarks that you see him ambulating by. And so one of the things that I really liked about annotating was that ability to be many different types of reader and to offer an argument, but to have the opportunity to deviate from it in ways that I thought might entertain and educate people.
I think you were extremely successful at that. I really liked that the very first annotation was a question. Why did Virginia Woolf alter the opening of Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street? What is the difference between gloves and flowers? And I felt that that set an inquiring tone to the rest of the annotations, that there was a quest for understanding, but also an openness to different interpretations.
And I think this raises another interesting point, which is that I think I increasingly think about a great deal of my writing as pedagogical, as trying to bring a kind of classroom experience, the good parts of a classroom experience, to readers outside of the classroom. And that's how I teach. I teach by asking those kinds of questions and by opening up the novels that we're reading to competing interpretations. I think that's the only rewarding way to teach a literature class. And so part of what I was thinking when I was writing the annotations was, how can I offer that experience, the experience of being taught and of having a question just sort of spark a train of thought in your mind, even if I'm not standing in front of the reader and saying, well, why do you think, but I'm really happy to hear you say that.
Did you have a kind of a platonic ideal of reader in mind as you were forming the annotations?
I mean, my always platonic ideal of a reader is my mother, she's a doctor. She's a pediatric pulmonologist. So she was swamped this past year, but she's a very good and smart casual reader. And she is sort of my go-to for a person who I know has the capacity to be interested by the literary, i.e., there are some people that I'm sure we know who say things like, well, I don't read fiction, I just read nonfiction books or things like that, right? So I'm not really, I feel like I could win over that kind of reader, but they're not the person that I really imagine. So, she's someone who is interested in literature, but who it's not her professional interest to know about it. And if I can find a way to connect with her or a reader like her that is humane enough and compassionate enough and interesting and entertaining enough that they're then willing to give me a certain leeway to offer a feminist reading or a Marxist reading or a kind of really historically nuanced reading of a particular detail in a novel, that's the kind of reader that I'm aspiring to reach.
And I imagine readers, especially who've engaged with the book before and are coming to it to enlarge their appreciation. What do you say is that?
I think that's correct. I mean, I think this is frankly a very difficult version of Mrs. Dalloway to read if you've never read the novel before, because on the level of quantity alone, I think there's actually more annotation text than there is novel text in this. And it was funny, the designers at Norton were quite cranky about it, because one of the things they have to do, and they're incredible, they're an incredible design team, and I'll tell you a story about the cover in a second. But one of the things that they had to figure out how to do was to balance the annotation text, the novel text, and the illustrations, so that the annotations could appear relatively close to where they appeared in line in the text. And that was just a punishing, a punishing job for them. And I thought they did a really, really brilliant job. But yes, I think if you've never read the novel before, then this would be a difficult version of the novel to do it with. But I think if you've read it once, perhaps if you read it in an undergraduate English class, or in passing in your adolescence or early adulthood, and you wanted to come back to it and be reminded why it is that people talk about it the way that they do, then this version is interested in and speaks very directly to that kind of reader.
There seemed to me to be certain types of annotation. Some of your annotations are quite matter of fact about what Bond Street was,
Right.
and there's another layer of annotation which is about pointing out comparisons in passages or changes that Virginia Woolf made over time, and another layer in which you give space to different critics from different periods and discuss their reactions. And I wondered if that was kind of a conscious approach on your part.
Yeah, I think, well, I don't know. I think the way that you lay it out is actually much neater and probably more thoughtful than I was when I was doing it. I think one thing that I had in mind, I suppose, was that, I mean, I'm an American who moved to the UK about 3 years ago. And I think that if you're someone without intimate familiarity with London, or even with the UK more generally, some of the place names and why they are where they are in the novel will seem confusing to you. So if you don't know what Bond Street is, what it signifies, what sort of person would do their shopping there, why it would be that that automobile that belongs to the Queen, the Prince, or the Prime Minister should be rolling through Bond Street and create that sort of that spirit of gossip that infects the novel in its second interlude. You just need a little bit of background information to understand why the novel is geographically set up, spatially set up the way that it is. And so that was one consideration that I did approach the novel in some ways as a foreigner to it, or as someone who is not from its particular environs, but who lives there now and was trying to learn how to understand some of the things that I still see around me. So that was one level of annotation, maybe, was the American annotating the English novel. The second interpretive kind of annotation is probably the one that is most pedagogical, or what I would think, like, if I were teaching this passage in a classroom, what would I want my students to take out of it? And so those kinds of annotations, it's useful to see what the passage looked like in previous drafts, because then you can see how intentionally Woolf was changing certain things to create certain kinds of effects. And I should say, just overall, this is one thing that really astonished me about Woolf, which is how unbelievably meticulous of a planner she was, how incredibly thoughtful and purposive she was about writing the novel, and how every single word gets a kind of, I think, attention that is strange to see among novel writers. It's much more usual to see among, say, short story writers, but among novel writers, she's so careful about the placement and the particularity of every single word, so that when she makes a change, you know she made that change for a reason. And I think figuring out how to suss out that reason puts you puts you in dialogue not only with your reader, but it sort of puts you in dialogue with her as a writer, and going back to the moment when she made the decisions that she made. So that's another way to think about the interpretive, right? It's not just educating the reader, but also opening up another kind of portal of communication with the writer when she was making that kind of decision.
Were there annotations that you're particularly fond of in retrospect?
I mean, there were some very fun ones to write. So, you and I have spoken a little bit about this, but the introduction to the Annotated Mrs Dalloway is very interested in Virginia Woolf's concept of character, what it means when writers talk about character, how they go about creating a character, and how a character is a sort of perplexing construction, because on the one hand, a character is merely scratches on a paper. And on the other hand, a character is someone that we invest with with a person-like presence, with personhood. And how do people do this? I mean, I find this continually fascinating. It's probably the most basic thing that novelists do, and yet it's so hard to do right. And she thinks about that a great deal, really a great deal. But so what was interesting for me was, in the spirit of Woolf and thinking about character, one of the things I noticed as I was annotating is how many characters or character names they are who don't even really rise to the level of minorness, but operate in more kind of decorative ways. So for instance, on the very first page, as Mrs. Dalloway is getting ready to buy the flowers herself, in the very next paragraph, it tells us that Rumpelmeyer's men were coming. And you think, well, who is Rumpelmeyer? And there's a version of that annotation that just talks about Rumpelmeyer's as a confectionery shop. But then the version of the annotation I offer you is actually of Rumpelmeyer as a person, as a character, and where he originated from, and when he came to the continent, and how he worked his way from Nice up to London. And so it gives you a little character portrait in the spirit of Woolf that is, of course, not necessary for you to understand what's happening in that passage. But, again, I think in the spirit of Woolf lets you tunnel a little bit deeper into one of the other merely decorative characters. The other example of that I really like is Edward Dent, whose shop Dent & Co. I believe Peter Walsh walks by. And Dent was the foremost timepiece maker for the British Empire in the 19th century. And he, I believe, began his life as an apprentice to a candle maker. But I think I write something like he had no passion for tallow and wicks. And offering those little character sketches, I think, brings something different to the novel, which is a sense of how its character ecosystem could be even bigger and even deeper than it already is.
In your introduction, which is has several really interesting sections to it that I would love to have a chance to talk about a bit, but you make a strong case for the novel reflecting a kind of philosophy of character that you put forward. And I wonder if you could perhaps explicate slightly what Woolf was thinking about with that.
So one of the arguments that the introduction makes is that Woolf was working on the novel at the same time that she was writing several of the essays collected in the Common Reader. And one of those essays is Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, which is an argument about what happens to characters, not just in novels, but in life, what happens to character between the late 19th century and the early 20th. And it contains that very famous line, on or around December 1910, the nature of character changed, right? And one of the arguments that she offers, at least, is that, well, two of the arguments that she offers, I think, in tandem with one another, is that first, it's no longer sufficient to believe that we can glean anything essential about people from the, let's say, 19th century realist descriptions of their face and figure, of their clothes and accessories, of their homes and their children, that a different and a deeper kind of psychological realism is necessary, or a different kind of psychological reckoning with what happens in the innermost lives of people is necessary. So that's one argument that she offers. And then the second argument, and I'm not saying these are right necessarily, I'm just saying that these are the arguments that she's offering. And then the second argument that she offers is that really anybody in this world that we look at, you, me, any of the 48 people on the Zoom, the person walking outside of my office window right now, has an infinitely rich depth of thought and feeling that one could access, and that anybody in the world could be the subject of a novel for this reason, because everyone in the world is touched by the same ecstasy and suffering of life, and that is enough, right? That is enough for the stuff of a novel. And the great critic Erich Auerbach understands this as being Woolf's sort of fundamentally democratic spirit of novel writing. And again, whether that's true or not, I have some questions or queries about it. And I talk about this a little bit in the annotations. Like, yes, it's all well and good to talk about the kind of democracy of character in this sense, but certainly it means something that the people who get the richest interiority in this novel are the members of the British ruling class, and not, for instance, their servants, who we just sort of see running around trying to organize their lives and their parties, right? So, but bracketing that seems to me the essence of Virginia Woolf's theory of character. And one of my favorite moments in the novel is toward the end. And for those of you who've read it, you might remember this, but for those of you who haven't, I'll just offer a little bit of a lead up to it, which is that Clarissa Dalloway lives across the street from an old woman who she sees going up and down the stairs of her house. And at the very end of the novel, after Clarissa has heard of Septimus Smith, the shell-shocked veteran, committing suicide, she retreats from the party, and she thinks about what it means that this man has thrown his life away. And she sees that woman across the street from her again, and she's about to put out her light and go to bed. And it's this extraordinary moment where Clarissa is trying to figure out what that woman is thinking, what she's feeling. And you realize as the reader that that woman could have been the main character of this novel, Mrs. Dalloway. There's no good reason why Clarissa Dalloway is necessarily the character of this novel. And that anyone who is adept at what Woolf called character reading would be able to see the potential for novelizing life in any human being that you would pass on the street or sit across from in the train car, which is what she does in Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown.
The sense of character reading is really interesting, and also the sympathetic character reading from a person who was, I don't even know if I know enough adjectives, waspish, judgmental, quite tough on, especially on her own friends. And yet she was, it's fascinating to me that she was able to develop this and express in her novels extraordinary sympathy for all sorts of different lives.
Well, and this is one place where I think her purposiveness is really important, because a lot of the characters, particularly the men, are written much less sympathetically in the earlier drafts than they end up in the actual novel. So the doctors, for instance, Dr. Holmes and Dr. Bradshaw, who are sort of clearly in the earlier drafts the villains of the novel, they become softened in her edits. And I think one of the reasons for that is because she is conscious of not creating sort of caricatures. You see the same thing with Peter Walsh, who is much sillier. I mean, he's still a little bit, like the critic Andrew Miller calls him gormless, which I've always liked, gormless. He's still gormless, but some of the hard edge of her satire of him has been sanded off through the revisions. And I think what's interesting about Woolf, I mean, you're certainly right that if you read the journals, for instance, the portraits that she offers of her friends they're devastating, particularly the ones of T.S. Eliot. Those are sort of my favorites. They're just completely devastating. But I think this is one way in which she was very thoughtful about what the difference between life and art might be. That in art or in fiction, you could not let your own prejudices show, because what would happen is that you would create these kind of flat characters, these unbelievable characters, but that the good fiction writer would be able to find something to soften the hardness of just about any character that she could create.
I was also interested in how she approached character building through people she knew, that she assembled bits and pieces of different people and found ways to insert those elements into the characters she was writing about.
Yeah, and herself included. And so the two details that I think always strike at my heart, at least when I read this novel, are that Septimus's hallucinations were very much based on her own hallucinations during her breakdowns. And she has a really painful diary entry where she wonders to herself whether she's writing the novel from pure emotion. And she says, "The mad scenes try me so much. They make me squint. I can only eke out 50 words at a time." And, you can tell that she's on the one hand a little bit magpie-like in the way that she collects details from her friends' lives, but that when she's writing, what I think is the kind of emotional core of the novel, which are the scenes of Septimus sitting in Regent's Park, believing that the trees and the sunlight are speaking to him, that they're singing a sort of ode, a Keatsian ode to truth and beauty, that those are very much coming from her own sense of what it means to see what she calls the insane truth of the world.
The book is hugely enjoyable to read, but has a kind of a towering reputation as a would it be right to say it's one of the foundational aspects of literary modernism in some sense, and especially her stream of consciousness, which some people at the time thought she might have been influenced by Ulysses, which she denied. How do you think, in your view, did she arrive at that as a technique, as a way of approaching character building and building the book?
Well, you see her starting to experiment with it in Jacob's Room, the previous novel. But when Jacob's Room comes out, well, one of the things that Leonard Woolf tells her when Jacob's Room comes out is that it's wonderful, but that it doesn't have a philosophy of life, he says. And if you read Jacob's Room, there is a sort of jerkiness to it, that she's unwilling to stay with any of the characters for as long as you feel like they deserve. And it becomes hard to attach to them in the same way that you can attach to the characters in Mrs. Dalloway. And it's unclear exactly how they relate to one another in this character system. I don't mean how they're related to one another. I just mean how it is that conceptually they relate to one another. And so when she started thinking about Mrs. Dalloway, she was thinking very hard about to build on what she was doing, what she had done in Jacob's Room, so that there was a philosophy of life to this novel. And one of the reasons that she has these two hinge characters, both Clarissa Dalloway and Septimus Smith, is because she says first that she wants Clarissa to see the truth and Septimus to see the insane truth. And then she says she wants characters that are on the side of life and characters that are on the side of death. And something that you realize is that just because Septimus kills himself doesn't mean he's on the side of death. In fact, the moment when he kills himself, which is so heart-wrenching to me, he thinks life was good, he did not want to die. And that in fact, paradoxically, for him killing himself becomes a way to freeze or to seize life at its best before he then has to be institutionalized. And the insane truth, the beauty that he sees, is cleansed from him. And so that's one way that she was thinking about it, was thinking about how you can have different characters sort of embody these different, I guess, philosophical or metaphysical positions. But then, the thing about Ulysses isn't quite right either, because she certainly read Ulysses, and she writes quite bitingly in her journal about Joyce, very snobbishly about Joyce, about how he's a sort of working class Irishman scratching at his pimples, and about how, how she doesn't believe that a great novel needs to be so tricky, so showy. And she was, of course, quite jealous too of T.S. Eliot's adulation of Joyce. And that's the other thing you see in the diaries. But when she starts planning Mrs. Dalloway, the other thing that she writes in her diaries is that she says, Joyce does all internals. You're completely inside people's minds. And Eliot does all externals. And she wanted to find some way to bridge the two. So one way that she does that is by creating these sort of characters that oppose one another in these ways, as I've been talking about. But the other way that she does it quite beautifully is by inserting these objects into the novel, like the motor car, the famous motor car, or the airplane that circles over London, and using those external objects to then sort of beam her narrator into the thoughts and into the minds of various characters that are standing around, all watching the same thing, whether it's the airplane circling or the motor car, or hearing the same thing, like characters hearing Big Ben or the clocks on Harley Street chiming. And so these external objects become ways of transitioning from one character to another. So you know that there's something out there in the world that they're all referencing, that they're all hearing or seeing at the same time. But then you are being pulled rather rapidly and intimately into one character or another's headspace.
I think you also note that in a sense, the bifurcation is not Clarissa versus Septimus, but Clarissa and Septimus balanced by everybody else.
Right. And in the early version, I mean, she writes in, I think, the 1928 afterword to the novel that she intended to have Clarissa kill herself at the party at the end. And, she introduces Septimus and offloads that onto him. He becomes the one who kills himself. But, the other way to think about the opposition is that there are characters in the novel who at one time in their lives had access to a kind of rich and ecstatic and sexually charged inner life. And so you think about Clarissa and her relationship with Sally Seton, or you think about Peter and his relationship with Clarissa. And as they have gotten older, that life has been buried under layers of responsibility and obligation, and really a sense of propriety. And that you see other characters who are so committed to that sense of propriety that they have no access to their sort of deep emotional lives. So you think of Richard Dalloway, for instance, buying flowers for his wife and taking them home to her and being incapable of telling her that he loves her, saying, I'm going to tell her, and then not being able to say it. And actually, in an earlier draft, she had him say it, and then she took it out. Or you think about a very minor character, little Mr. Bowley, who stands watching the motor car, his heart sealed with wax, because he simply cannot feel anything except a kind of unctuous patriotism for the empire. But he can't feel for the young widows that are standing there watching it, who've lost their husbands in the war. And so you have, on the one hand, those totally sort of stoic, repressed characters. You have in the middle, Clarissa, Peter, Sally, and then you have characters who are so overwhelmed by their emotions, like Septimus, who simply cannot function in society. And Doris Kilman is maybe the other character who you would put there. And so one of the things that I think Woolf's character reading offers us is a kind of portrait, and this is the critic Alex Swordling's argument, that it offers us a sort of portrait of the British social system, and particularly among the British ruling classes, the belief in that stoicism, that hardness, that stiff upper lip, and the way that other characters in the novel agitate against that. And when they agitate against that, they become problems for the social system, and thus they need to be separated, institutionalized, isolated, or in Septimus's case, he kills himself before any of that can happen.
You point out that Virginia, like my friend Virginia,
that's
viewed this as a kind of social criticism, that she was it's not simply a novel about people, it's also what would you say, exploring the class structures that they're trapped in.
I'd say it's political satire. And I think many people don't see the novel that way. It was interesting during lockdown, a friend of mine who works at CUNY, the City University of New York, was teaching the novel, and she asked if I would substitute for her for one of her classes. And I said, I'd be glad to. And her students were actually quite forthright in saying, we don't really understand why in the year 2021, when a pandemic has made it impossible for us to actually show up in our classrooms, when for the past 6 months we have been watching sort of massive protests outside our windows about race and about class, we don't understand why we should read a novel about a posh British woman throwing a party. And I said, well, that's actually only a very minor part of this novel. And in fact, to me, the much more important part of this novel is looking at what happens when you live in a social system that refuses to take responsibility for mass death. Because this is a novel, it's an interwar novel, and the memory of the war is everywhere in it. And the problem with Septimus is not that he hallucinates, but that he is the victim of a set of institutions that have no idea how to provide care for him and are actually completely uninterested in doing so. And so I said, right now, we are seeing many of the same things that Woolf was writing about. We are seeing people trying to figure out how to go on in the world when there has been so much death around us, and we don't know how to grieve it, and nobody has been held accountable for it. I mean, it feels like a crime has been committed. And who do you blame for that? Who has taken responsibility for it? And I said, you see on the one hand, the incredible ecstatic desire to claim life and to say, okay, we realize how precious life is. We realize how extraordinary it is to walk down a street surrounded by other people and think, oh my God, this is what it means for people to be out in a city. This is what it means for life to go on. And at the same time, feel incredibly anxious about that and think, well, okay, but what have we learned? What has the war taught us? What has the pandemic taught us about the way that our social systems are organized and the role that we play in them? And so I think that convinced them that I think that convinced them that they should read Mrs. Dalloway. But when I teach the novel or when I lecture on it, which I've been doing since the book has come out, I mean, I just see increasingly the fact that certain political structures and the emotional way we relate to those political structures actually haven't changed that much between Woolf's day and our own.
I'm cognizant that we're time is passing, and
it is, yes.
We've hardly scratched the surface of a wonderful book, but I really want to mention your introduction, which has a number of parts, and some of them are highly personal, and one of them especially suggests that you were within 20 miles of Much Ado, and how I wish you had come in, but your visit to Monk's house and a moment of connection with possibly with one of the stewards and with some of the objects that Virginia Woolf loved, and I was that was a lovely way, I thought, to honor Virginia Woolf. And I wonder if you'd like to tell a little of that story.
Oh, thank you. It's my favorite. I mean, I told you this before. It's my favorite part of the introduction, and it's sort of broken my heart that no one has mentioned it at all. And so I'm so happy that you did. I mean, the way that the introduction concludes is with a trip that I took to Monk's house before I started annotating, and this experience or this encounter that I had with a young docent that was there. And I'm sure actually many of the people on this call have been to Monk's house. So you might in fact know what I'm speaking about when I say that she showed me what she believed were Virginia Woolf's two favorite objects in her bedroom. And those of you who've been to Monk's house will remember that she has the incredible complete set of Shakespeare, the art in Shakespeare that she actually bound by hand to stave off her migraines. And I thought that's what one of them was going to be, but the docent said, no, 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 there are actually these two other things. And she walked me over to the mantelpiece, and she held up this really beautiful iridescent shell called Venus's ear. And with one hand, and with the other hand, she held up a cloud glass, which is a convex painter's mirror. And so it's not like a regular mirror, but it's one of those mirrors that shows you things all out of proportion, so that everything that's far looks close, and that everything that's close looks sort of strangely elongated and bulges in all sorts of weird angles. And we started talking about it, and she asked me what I thought about the objects, and I told her that I thought the mirror is for showing you things not as they are. And I thought about that wonderful scene in Mrs. Dalloway when Clarissa Dalloway is looking in her own mirror, and she thinks, this is who she was. This is who she was when some pressure called on her to be herself, dart-like and definite. And nobody but her could know something, I'm paraphrasing, nobody but her could know the many, many selves that were behind this appearance. And so that's what a cloud glass allows you to see, right? It doesn't allow you to see yourself dart-like and definite. It shows you yourself with your nose over here and your eye over here and your chin 18 times as large. And it's estranging in this wonderful way that I think her novels also are. And then the Venus's ear, if you hold it up to your ear, of course, you hear voices that aren't there. And I think that that's, part of the practice of annotation too, is trying to gather voices together into one space that aren't yours and that aren't physically present, but that you want to have a conversation with. And so I end on that just because, those objects seem to me so important for thinking about what it means to annotate and what it means to annotate this book in particular.
Well, I would like to say thank you. Thank you not only for joining us tonight and leading us through some of the rich byways of Mrs. Dalloway, but thank you for opening up the book for me and for our customers. I think that the annotations will offer so much pleasure to so many people. And those of you who've tuned in, if you don't have a copy of the book, if you don't have access to a copy, ask your local library to get a copy. If you can't buy one, borrow one. The book is a marvel and beautifully designed. Thanks to your husband for the wonderful maps, and thanks to Norton for bringing it out. So Merve, thank you so much. I'd like to invite everybody who's joined us. Why don't you just take a moment and unmute yourself and maybe express your support for Merve and her extraordinary work. And we hope that it finds an audience as appreciative as can be.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I'm so excited to come into the bookstore next time I'm down there.
I hope you will. That would be, we would love to offer you some tea or something even stronger than tea.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming along.
Very excited.
Thank you for joining us. Adam and Susan, nice to see you.
Great to see you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
That was wonderful.
Wonderful.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Wonderful.
And here's another American just suggesting, I read Woolf as a foreigner. Your book is proudly displayed in the window of my little local bookshop, 192 Books in Chelsea, New York City.
Yes. Oh, I didn't. I thank you. I did a lovely event with Michael Cunningham at 192 Books. We just gabbed and gabbed about. Yeah. So if you, it should be on their website if you're interested. He's very funny, but thank you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm going to end the meeting now.
Thank you. Me
Really
too.
appreciate your joining us. Lovely to meet you. Look
Lovely
forward
to
to
meet
meeting you another time, and good luck with your project.
Bye, everybody.
Goodbye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you for coming out.
Thank you from Germany.